I intentionally made the title of my talk today a little bit disconcerting, The Danger of the Gift of Theological Education. So all of you are here for theological education of some kind. Many of you are Bible minors. Many of you love those classes so much you signed up for more and became a Bible major or getting a master's degree. Why then would a Bible prof talk about the danger of theological education? Well, the reason I want to do so is there are dangers, and we need to be aware of what they are and how to avoid them. Before we start with thinking about the dangers, let me talk about the good part of theological education. The screen is broken today, so you can look at those screens over there, which is even better for me because you're looking even farther away from me as you look at the screens. So I'm not all that sad about it. So theological education, you get interaction with the life-giving Bible. You learn about God, spiritual formation practices that help you grow, ministry skills, whether it's learning how to share your testimony in the Acts class or entire classes devoted to preaching on the grad side. There's these skills that we learn and seek to improve our skills in. And we do all this together with other students who love God, with faculty who want to help you love God as well. What could possibly go wrong with theological education that has so many good parts to it? To talk about that, I want to talk about an Old Testament character, not surprisingly. I'm an Old Testament prof. We have to talk about Old Testament. And so I want to talk about Solomon. And Solomon is someone who received a lot of gifts. Open your Bible or Bible app to 1 Kings chapter 10. And we're going to read just a little bit about some of the gifts that Solomon received. 1 Kings 10, verse 23. Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. To put it in modern terms, Solomon would have broken Twitter. This guy was so wise that everyone traveled well out of their way and brought a whole bunch of money to hear him talk. He could have been the ultimate motivational speaker today. He would have made so much money. And even in those times, he made a lot of money because of these gifts that God had given him. He is the wisest man. In addition, he was enabled to build the temple. If you remember the story, his father David, God said to him, "No, you can't build the temple, but your son Solomon can." And so Solomon had the privilege to build the temple. Here's a reconstruction model, perhaps what the front would have looked like. Here's the interior part of the temple. So the privilege of being able to build the temple where God met his people would have been pretty incredible for Solomon. All kinds of other areas as well, Solomon excelled. Reading on in 1 Kings 10, look at verse 26. Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as a sycamore of the Shephelah. And Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kue, and the king's traders received them from Kue at a price. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. The man has so many gifts from God. Now, if you know the rest of the story, there's some negative parts about Solomon as well. And if you were to read on in chapter 11, you would immediately see some of those negative things. For example, he had many wives that led him astray from following God. But there's a lot more going on in 1 Kings than is obvious, because the author of Kings expects you to know another text and to read Kings in light of that text. And I'm guessing you don't know this text, so I'm going to tell you what it is. It's Deuteronomy 17. It's called the Law of the King. So turn back to Deuteronomy 17, but keep this text in 1 Kings in your mind as we go back and read the Law of the King. So before Israel even has a king, there's regulations for what a king is to do and how they are to act. So let's start reading in verse 14 of Deuteronomy 17. When you come to the land that Yahweh your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you, whom Yahweh your God will choose. And then the law begins with the regulations. So let's think about how Solomon does with all of these regulations. First one from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Solomon's good there. He's an Israelite. He's not a foreigner. He's past the first one. Number 2, verse 16. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself. First Kings mentioned he had a lot of horses. And reading on, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since Yahweh has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And where does Solomon get his horses from? Egypt. The one place where he's specifically told, don't buy horses from there, that's where he goes and buys them. Verse 17, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Well, we know how that turned out. Nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Going back to 1 Kings, let me read one line there. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone. If you've been in Jerusalem, there's a lot of stone. To say that it's as common as stone means that's excessive silver. And so once again, he has not followed what the law of the king has said. The rest of the law of the king talks about how the king in Israel doesn't get to make their own law. The picture on the screen is the law of Hammurabi in the Louvre today. And this is standard practice for kings in the ancient Near East. They get to make laws to show something about themselves. Israelite kings, they're required to copy the law that God already gave them. And the king is under the law, just like the rest of the people. They are not above the law. They don't get to make the law. They follow the law just like everyone else. And so when we look at the life of Solomon through the lens of Deuteronomy, we see there's a considerable negative side. So we see things like the foreign wives, following other gods, the wealth and military power, far more than he should have. One other interesting feature is based in geographical notes. In 1 Kings 4, it lists how Israel is divided into 12 areas. And so here's the map, 12 different areas. And each area was responsible for 1 month of feeding the king's household. Now, think about how many wives Solomon had, presumably how many kids he had as well. This is a lot of food to allow the royal household to eat. And so each month, one of these 12 administrative districts would feed the royal household. Now, look closely at the map. There's a gaping hole in the bottom left. Guess where that is? That's Judah, which is Solomon's home tribe. So he says to everyone else, I want all of you to give lots of money to help me eat, but my tribe, you get a free pass. You don't need to do anything. And so later on, when Solomon dies and the people rebel under Rehoboam, his son, this is a great example of why. He has preferred his own people at the expense of everyone else. And so the author of Kings wants us to read Solomon's life through the lens of Deuteronomy and to see how Solomon is trusting in all these things that he should not be trusting in. One other literary technique that the author of Kings uses is he compares Solomon to Pharaoh. So in Exodus 1, we see Pharaoh oppressing Israel. And in Kings, the author uses much of the same language to talk about how Solomon treats people that are under him. So, for example, the term forced labor appears both in Exodus with what Pharaoh is doing to the Israelites, and is what Solomon does to the people under him. This forced labor also built store cities, just like in Exodus. The work that they did is called difficult service, exactly the same phrase in Exodus as in Kings. And just like the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites, so then Solomon enslaved the foreigners in Israel as well. And so through these subtle literary links, the author of Kings is showing us Solomon received a lot of gifts, but he's just like Pharaoh. And I think that is a powerful note for us as we read Exodus. When we read a text like Exodus, we tend to want to say, I'm going to identify with God's people. God is the one who sees me. God's going to rescue me. God is on my side. But Kings challenges that reading and forces us to ask this question. Are you sure? Who are you in this story? If Solomon is reading Exodus, the book of Kings challenges Solomon to say, wait, I'm acting like Pharaoh. And I think we should at least ask the question as we read Exodus, are we acting like Pharaoh in some way as well? Are we oppressing someone? Are we using some gift that we have to someone else's expense, to their harm, to their detriment? And so I think we, as we read Old Testament texts, don't immediately jump to say, oh, I'm the good guy. We at least need to ask questions. Are we becoming Pharaoh or Solomon? I want to return to thinking about theological education. So Solomon had his gifts, and he used them in a variety of good ways as well as illegitimate ways. How then can the gift of theological education become a danger, become a problem? So the first way I want to talk about is becoming Pharaoh. And we can think of this as, in some way, weaponizing your theological education, which might sound odd at first. How would I use my theological education as a weapon? Well, we can do that in a variety of ways. So here's one possibility. Perhaps because you assume you have all of the answers, because you've been through all the Bible and theology classes, you have all of the methods down, you know what works because you've been through all the ministry classes, you've seen all the skills and gained them. Maybe that causes you to no longer listen. You're no longer engaging in conversation with people of the Bible, but you have become the conversation. I'm going to tell you what the Bible says. I'm going to tell you the best way to do this ministry, whatever it is. And so we have an inability to listen, potentially, if we use our theological education in this way. Or perhaps, like Solomon, you're privileging your group at the expense of another group. Pastors routinely face this temptation, but all of us, in some way, I think, do as well. Perhaps it's our church, perhaps it's our theological tradition, perhaps it's just our group of friends, perhaps it's our favorite doctrine, whatever the case might be. Are we privileging that at the expense of someone else? And just in general, are we using our theological education as a temptation to power in some way, for control? And we can look at Solomon's life and see examples of that there. And the law of the king calls Solomon and calls us, like, that's not the way of Yahweh. That's not the way of God. It is not the path of power. It is not gathering more horses and chariots and silver. It's about trusting God. That's the core. And if we use our theological education as a way to power, we are misusing that theological education. A second danger is what I call imposter syndrome. It's similar to the first, where you assume you have all the answers and methods, but deep down, you know you don't. And so then you just wonder, what day is it that I will be revealed as a fraud? What day is it that everyone's going to realize, aha, they don't know anything at all? And so we live in this constant fear of being revealed as someone who doesn't know what they should know. And so this is kind of the flip side of becoming Pharaoh. Both of these dangers assume you have all the answers, but those in the second category know they don't, but can't get past this expectation that they should. And so they feel like a failure in some way. You might be surprised at this, but faculty routinely struggle with imposter syndrome. We all think there's more that we should know and that we are a failure in some way and what we should be doing more. And as I talk to students, I know this is relatively common among you as well. We have this expectation of what we should know and be able to do, and if we don't match up to that expectation, we worry about when people will see us as the fraud that we think we are. The answer to this is to question that expectation. Maybe you have picked up an assumption that is false, and maybe you shouldn't have all the answers. Maybe that itself is the problem. A third danger, I call this Bible is Jello. The Bible and following God just means whatever you want it to mean. We don't know how Solomon read the law of the king, but reading between the lines, I can kind of guess how he might have. That's for a different king. Or it's not really serious about Egypt. Like, I can get him from Egypt. It'll be okay. And you can imagine perhaps some of the exegetical hoops he might have jumped through to say, it might have meant that for someone else, but I don't need to worry about it. And this is a real danger for many. I think this is particularly true for those who start reading about theological controversies or who start studying various biblical texts and see how much scholars disagree. And then the next jump that they make is to say, well, there's no answer. If these smart people can't agree, then there must be no answer. And then you just get rid of it all, in a sense. And I think that is dangerous as well. And then finally, Bible as textbook. This is the danger we all face in academia. When I give my students reading assignments out of the Bible really is their textbook. But how do we avoid the Bible becoming a textbook and just becoming another dead book for us? How do we continue to meet the living God through a textbook? And so these are all dangers of theological education. I want to close by using my own life as a little bit of an example. My specialty is the book of Exodus, and I don't like to call myself an expert on Exodus, but by any objective standard, I suppose I kind of am. So I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Exodus. I've published multiple academic articles on Exodus, whether honoring parents or hardening the heart and so on. I teach a class devoted to Exodus every semester and have for quite a while. And I'm in process of co-authoring a commentary on Exodus right now. When it's published, it'll be one of the longest commentaries on Exodus ever written since Exodus was written. And so I'm going to write a lot of words on Exodus. And so I suppose I'm an expert on Exodus. And in that, I have definite opinions about Exodus. And so today, when I finish preaching here, I'm going to go straight to my class on Exodus, and we're going to talk about hardening the heart. And I have a theory about what's going on there, and what it means, and what it doesn't mean, how we think about it ethically, and so on. And so I love teaching Exodus, and one reason is to talk about these things. I have lots of definite opinions about Exodus. But here's what I want to say that might be a bit unexpected. Because I'm an expert on Exodus, I know much less about Exodus than most people. No, not in any kind of objective sense. I know a lot more facts about Exodus than most of you. But what I mean by that is most of you who don't know as much about Exodus, you don't know what you don't know. And for me, since I've spent so much of my life studying Exodus, I don't know a whole bunch about Exodus. Because everything I learned about Exodus just opens up more questions for me. And if you come into Exodus and theological education with the expectation that you're going to have all of the answers, this can be really discouraging. Because you want to study something and come to master it, to come to understand every part of it. And then when you learn more and more and you get more and more questions, you realize, oh, this learning thing never ends. I'm never going to master every part of whatever this is. And for many people, that can be really discouraging because of this expectation that I'm going to master this thing. I'm going to take a class on Exodus, and by the end of it, I'm going to master Exodus. No, you're not. You're going to learn a lot of cool stuff about Exodus. You're going to meet God in some great ways, but you are not going to master it. I'm not going to master it. And the more I study it, the more questions that come up, and the more excited I am to study those questions and to see what God is doing in all these corners of Exodus. And so the point of learning is not so you can stop learning. The point of learning is to continue to raise new questions, to see the glory of all these new areas that are opening up to you as you study, and to meet God in all of these new ways as you study whatever your topic is. And one of the things I love about teaching Exodus is my students teach me. It's routine that I come back from my Exodus class, I pull up my commentary, and I write a short note because of something a student said. My co-author, Chloe's son, and I, we occasionally disagree on something. Last semester, I was talking with my students about one of those disagreements on the character of Jethro in Exodus 2, and my students convinced me I was wrong and she was right. And so I had to go back and change the commentary and say, Chloe, you were right. My students taught me that, and I don't feel threatened by that at all. I love it. This is the way it should be. And so our theological education, as it makes you an expert in something, and all of you, because you have a Bible minor, Bible major, master's degree, you will be viewed by your church as some kind of expert, whether you like it or not. The point is not that you have all the answers. The point is that you can bring others into what you've learned and help each other as a community see God in the text. Finally, Exodus for me has been a lifeline in a variety of ways. For the past few years, I've experienced some of the hardest years in my life, utterly gut-wrenching. And for some people, when this happens, there's a sense of the Bible, I can't go there anymore. God's let me down. For me, I was fortunate that was not my experience. I was able to go to Exodus in particular and meet God in some new ways. And so in the middle of these really hard years, God has sustained me, partly through some really good friends, rejuvenated prayer life, but Exodus in particular. This is where God has met me. And this is another reason why I love Exodus. God has encouraged me so much through this book. I want to bring my students into this as well. There are some verses at the end of Exodus 2 that have become a bit of a life verse for me. The first 2 chapters, there's a lot of oppression, and it doesn't seem like God's doing anything. And at the end of Exodus 2, we get this highly redundant statement of how much God cares about them. And God heard their cries, and God remembered his covenants with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God knew. That's a beautiful verse of how God cares for his people, even in those times when it feels like God is distant. Commentators debate on that last part, and God knew. God knew what? I think the answer is yes. God knew. God knew them personally. God knew what was going on. God just knew. And these verses have been so helpful and so life-giving for me in these past few years. And so as I study Exodus, I love studying it with people. And my challenge for you when thinking about your theological education, how is it that God gives you life through that? And then how can you bring life to others through what God has given to you in your theological education? Here's the list of facts about theological education again. Knowledge about God, interaction with the life-giving Bible, spiritual formation practices, ministry skills, community formation. I challenge each of you to think about those 4 dangers I listed off. Becoming Pharaoh, oppressing people with your theological knowledge. Imposter syndrome, feeling like you're a fraud. Bible as jello, just giving up on the whole thing altogether. Bible as textbook, forgetting that there's a life-giving God behind the word. What is it that most is a danger for you? And how can you address this danger as you continue in your Bible theology and ministry classes? Daniel Kim, when he asked me to speak, he sent me a description of the series for the year, and this last sentence really stuck out to me, so I don't want to close with this sentence. All the more, we need the reminder that we are saved by faith alone and not faith plus. Not faith plus a Biola degree, not faith plus a seminary degree, not faith plus a booming ministry, but sola fide.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.